we've done one in the past. We'd like to make improvements this year and hopefully lay some groundwork for future CECs, again, with the goal of really just trying to increase parent CEC communication, which is really the sort of obviously the core of what we do. So we've talked about a lot of things up till this point, and tonight's meeting is really to start to put some flesh out some ideas and kind of develop some structure around them. And we have two main goals for tonight, one of which is just start talking about what categories and questions we might want to focus on. And the second goal is to talk about whether we want to use a vendor, because we have some budget money that could be reallocated for that purpose. So with that being said, I think what we'll do is we'll have sort of discussion with the members that are on. I see myself and Simeon, and then we will definitely open it up for comments from anyone else who's on. And these are really informal, a lot more informal than our normal meetings. So we will definitely welcome some questions. So I think what we should do first is, I wouldn't mind having Simeon sort of lead off, if you don't mind, Simeon, and just go through like maybe your questions. If Natalia can get those up on the screen, and you can sort of share your thinking on that. And then I have a set of questions I submitted as well.
These questions are in no particular order. They're just brainstorming questions. But I think there's sort of some buckets maybe we want to think about. And so the big division is what has happened this year and how do you feel about it? And what do you want to happen in the future? I guess is sort of the two sort of questions. So if we start with the questions about this particular year, there's sort of a couple of types of questions. One is to actually get some granular detail about what people actually experience. And this is sort of factual information, how much time did your kids spend in remote learning? How much time did they have live instruction? How many days did they go to school? Those kinds of questions. And so I think one of my questions about these questions is, what is the district able to provide us? And what do we have to actually go to parents to get? So for instance, I'm kind of curious for those students who are actually doing remote learning, how much of that time was spent actually face-to-face with a teacher, and how much was spent on their own doing, remote assignments or watching videos or things like that. And then thinking there's the other sort of more qualitative questions about their satisfaction with the experience, or how they feel about it, those kinds of questions. So there's that. Then thinking about the future, I have sort of some questions about priorities, what they'd like to see, sort of whether they think their children are prepared for next year, and that might inform how much intervention or social emotional support or counseling or tutoring, things like that, we might want to ask for as well. So, and then I started just thinking about types of response sets we might use for these various types of questions.
When you say types of response sets, what do you mean?
So, a Likert scale, how many points, what types of words we might use, poor, fair, good, excellent, or likely, very likely, yes, no.
Got it.
Things like that.
Would that one to some extent be determined if we decide to use a vendor and what their setup is like?
Yeah, but most of their setups allow you to customize this kind of thing. So
yeah,
I mean,
sure.
The question is going to be often, if we're doing some kind of scale, do we want to do a 4-point, a 5-point, a 7-point, things like that, sort of ratings. I mean, those are all things I think we can figure out later, but I think it's more important that we think about what the questions are that we want to have.
Agree. And when you first said, what can the district provide? What do we have to get? Like, help me understand that more, because in my mind, the district is, and has obviously agreed to cooperate on this. They'll provide sort of, some data that gets provided to the vendor, and then aren't all the questions sort of coming from the parents? Like, what would we be expecting them to provide in terms of?
So I think most of it is the factual types of questions. And my sense is the district can't provide much of that either.
Okay.
They can tell us basically how many kids are signed up for hybrid versus remote, but I don't think they can tell us how much time the kids are spending with a live teacher. I don't think they're collecting that information. I don't think anybody's tracking it.
Right. Which would be part of the reason for doing this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Is anyone from the district on? I know I've talked to a few people. I don't see any names here that are immediately jumping to my attention. Okay.
Natalia, do you mind? Are you sharing? Or Simeon, are you sharing? Can you just scroll down? Yeah. Thank you.
I also thought it might be interesting to sort of look at individual subjects, because part of, I think, the whole pandemic has been whether or not kids are getting certain things that they used to get in the same amounts. I'm thinking obviously of PE and art and music, but also parents might have individual concerns, particularly around something like reading, reading levels, things like that.
And Simeon, did you set this up as like a logic? So that first question would take you on two different paths, whether your child has been in the building or not?
Well, I'm not sure. I didn't actually have it that far thought out, but I think part of the analysis would definitely be to look at the difference in responses based on who was in the building and which kids were 100% remote.
I think people who opted for blended have had a really different experience than maybe all remote. And it might be worth it.
Well, I also have some questions in there about what blended really meant for them. So I think there's a difference between a parent who signed it up for blended, but then their kid is in middle school or high school and only got 3 or 4 days basically in a building before the school shut down again. And so they didn't really have blended experience, versus some of the parents actually have kids who are getting 5 days of instruction right now.
Unless the school closes because there's 2 cases.
Yeah.
Right.
Not speaking from personal experience.
Right.
I think it'd be interesting to ask some more detailed questions to try to get a sense of how much time do kids actually spend in the building and see how that tracks with their satisfaction and experience.
I saw your questions earlier, and forgive me if you guys already discussed this. Sorry, I was late, but I was trying to think about, take off like my CEC hat, put on my parent hat, and like, what do I want the district to know more than anything, come, right now and then in preparation for the next school year. And it's, what are you, and it's a question, as Stephen said, it's like, what are you doing for my child for the fall, or my children for the fall, to make sure that they will make up what they missed and that they will have a better learning experience. So, it's like, I'm almost less concerned with like how bad this has been, which some of the questions address, like how, by subject, how well has it gone, or how satisfied are you? I mean, I think we can probably, without a survey, surmise that it hasn't been great for the majority of people involved. So it's like, how do we create a survey that sort of answers a question, but then also helps inform policy? I don't know.
Right.
Well, that's the thing where we started the conversation with sort of thinking about 2 buckets. And one bucket is, what was your experience like? And the next bucket is, what do you want going forward in the future? So we just started by talking about the first bucket, but you're pulling us into the second, which I think I don't have as many questions sort of brainstormed here. The question is, do we want to ask parents to prioritize what they want?
And I'll add one comment to this, which is, I would ideally like to see if we can get our hands on the citywide survey, because I wouldn't want to replicate, like, if we can get D20 data on some of these same questions, then we don't have to use them in ours. And so I feel like a lot of the citywide survey will cover, now it'll be a different point in time, of course, but that's just one sort of thought I've had, is to the extent we can try to avoid doubling up with what the city's asking our parents, maybe we save space for other questions.
Can we get a copy of that survey so we can see what those questions are?
I've been looking around, and I don't think, yes, I mean, we definitely should. That's on my checklist of things.
And then the other question is, how long is it going to take the DOE to release that data?
Yep.
It could be months and months.
Like, I think this question that's on the screen here, do you believe your child will be ready for the next grade level in the fall, is the main theme of what's happening, and sort of the starting point, and how do we build a survey off of that instead of a retrospective that asks what satisfaction has been like over the past year.
Yeah, I like the forward-looking view a lot. I agree. with maybe enough background to inform us, whether we get that from the citywide one or whether we ask a few questions about it. But definitely, I like. And the other thing, of course, is like, this shouldn't guide us right now because this is totally just brainstorming, but what's the average number of questions we should, shoot for here before we, and to some extent, I think some of the vendors could tell us, the optimal number until you get survey fatigue, so-called. But
I was also wondering if we want to ask about specific policy decisions, like, do you think there should be tutoring, or do you think children should have the opportunity to repeat a grade if you think it would benefit them?
Yep, I was wondering that too. And that, David, I think our conversation last Friday a little bit touched on that. If you guys remember David's comments, he sort of said, and this is just what David's saying, it's not necessarily what we have to say, but he was sort of saying that wouldn't be as helpful since that's out of his hands, so-called, so to speak. On the other hand, I do think he's open to, and I chatted with him once today, and I do think he's open to that kind of questioning if we can sort of take it as a voice to the DOE to some degree. But he was sort of saying, in his words, what worked, what didn't, based on these challenges, what kind of things should we be, sort of looking to do going forward. So that sort of touches on what we're talking about, I think.
I think the question about, I don't know what page it's on, but about would you want a remote option? Like what kind of language, or learning would you want for your child? I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Would you be okay with, remote learning? If you said yes to that, would you be okay with remote learning administered district level or something like that, starts pulling it away from the schools, and maybe we can get some feedback around that?
And again, like a related question, just maybe some kind of question. I don't know how we phrase this, but are you comfortable, based on what we know today about the pandemic, are you planning to send your child in if 5-day in-person learning is available?
Yeah. Did I have a question?
Yeah. Sorry, Simeon. I was just going to say, I wonder, when we filled out that survey in the summer to pick either blended or all remote for our children, I wonder how close to real that was. Because I know the schools had to do a ton of follow-up with people who then maybe changed their mind or wanted to wait and see. I'm just curious how honest, if there's any sort of data on how honestly people fill that out. Because it is hard to say in March. I know what I would say, but it's hard to say now in March what you're going to do in September.
Right. This is.
The survey didn't even work because basically, if you didn't, you still had an option as a default. So it wasn't an either or.
Right.
I can pick this and opt out any minute I want. So it didn't really generate the right results.
Yeah. And we have the enrollment data, right? He shared that with us last meeting of how many people are doing remote versus, it's the proportion's huge for remote versus blended. Or
yes.
Yeah.
It's about 70%, I think.
Yeah.
But we can't get it by school.
Oh, we don't have it by school. Okay. Yeah, that would be interesting too, because I think that speaks maybe to some of, the specific questions you have around ELL, MLL, IEP, maybe socioeconomic, like which schools have higher enrollment in person versus not. That would be interesting to know.
So I think this is something we're going to have to follow up on with David, because it does not sound like they're comfortable with school level data. He's basically been pretty clear about, I'm happy to talk about aggregate, but not, that's the school level.
Part of me is trying to, and I know what you mean, Simeon. I'm trying to reconcile that with the fact that what they've talked about so far is transferring data that, this stuff is going to be school level. If they're talking about a download from ATS, parent emails, going to a vendor, that's, I'm 90% sure school is a field in that. Like I talked about that with Bill and Sylvia.
the question is, are they going to release that, or are they just going to say, we don't want to release that, you're going to have to do everything as just an aggregate? In which case, I would be very suspicious, because we had such a bias of certain schools filling it out and other schools not.
Yeah.
I do think it's important to try to look at, are there certain neighborhoods in our community that are having different experiences? And that's partly why I'm interested in this sort of current data about people's experiences and satisfaction, to see if it's located in certain places or certain types of programs.
Yeah. Just another point on that. Like, I've talked ad nauseum to David and everyone about getting more responses from schools we historically haven't heard much from. So I feel like, yeah, I do think we need to follow up, because on the one hand, they definitely seem in favor of that, you know, trying to view this by school and trying to see, are the schools outside of Bay Ridge actually responding to these things in a good way.
But I understand the feeling of not wanting to put the schools on the spot and have them sort of singled out as, you know,
yeah,
good or bad or problematic, or, you know,
yeah,
parents are more or less satisfied in certain schools.
yeah, like maybe just publishing response rates by school is different than publishing satisfaction by school, obviously. Okay.
Are there other forward-looking kinds of questions that you can think about? I mean, I had sort of a whole list of sort of priorities, and I sort of was trying to think of how granular you want to get and sort of what you're interested in asking people about.
Yeah, it's a great question. And yeah, go ahead, Dina.
No, you go ahead, Stephen.
Well, I'm going to fall back on the, you know, I haven't done this as often as you guys have, which I've said before, but for me, a big part of it falls back on, let's make it manageable for parents so that we get quality answers. And so, you know, in my mind, I'm sort of thinking about, like, you know, a few high level categories, a few buckets, call it 4 buckets, and maybe 2 to 3 questions in each bucket. And let's cut it at that. And again, that might not be, it's not going to give us as much as we might want to know, but it might lead for better overall results. That's just one thought.
You like this question of ranking priorities?
So let's see here. Which page is this on?
Towards the end, basically I said, what are your biggest priorities for next year? Rank these. And then the list I had included in-school instruction, academic acceleration, academic remediation, social emotional learning, counseling, extracurriculars, tutoring, culturally responsive curriculum. I was wondering if anybody had any other ideas.
Here's a question, and I don't have the answer, so I'm not saying I do. Do you think these are all kind of apples to apples categories, if you will? Like some of these speak to in-class instruction, and then you also have counseling and extracurricular, for example. Yeah. Like, do you think we should break it into sort of instructional priorities and then maybe everything else, for example? Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. That's the problem with this question.
It's like the hierarchy of needs. Like, if I'm reading this, it's like in-school instructions 1 through 7.
Right.
Like, you know, they need to go to school, and then all the other things come when they're actually in school, you know, to some degree or not, you know, whether it's up to our standards or not, but I don't know. I like a priority question, but yeah, I got to sit with that one for a little bit.
Yeah.
Are there any other categories you'd want to add?
I mean, I think one of the things that's missing, and I don't know, maybe it falls under the in-school instruction bucket, but it's the, like, teacher feedback, both to my student and to me as a parent. But, you know, that's really been missing. I have no idea how my kids are doing. You know, like, in COVID times, are they doing okay? Yeah, maybe they're surviving and they're showing up, and some kids, you know, can't even show up. But how, it's like the assessment piece that we keep talking about. Like, how are they actually doing? Did they fall behind in reading and writing? Yeah, probably. Did they fall behind in math? Did they fall behind, you know, emotionally? Yeah. You know, so I need, you know, at what point next year do I get some feedback about how my kids are actually doing overall?
Yeah. And I had
Right.
2 questions at the end that I took from our last survey. One was, do you believe your child will be ready for the next grade, which
Yeah.
is sort of an encompassing kind of question.
Mhm.
The other one was more specific about how satisfied are you with the feedback you've received about your child's learning this year?
One thing I just wanted to go back to on that Dina had mentioned was the evaluating how are your kids, how are we evaluating where your kids are, and does that get into the question of assessments? Like, I don't know if we even, this topic comes up a lot now, and seems to be a little bit controversial.
Yeah.
And then also, what are we evaluating kids against? Like, what is the curriculum? Just getting a better sense of the curriculum, and sort of the, what are the benchmarks? How are we evaluating? All these studies coming out about learning loss, 3 months, 5 months behind in math, whatever. Are schools doing that in the district? I don't know. Is the city doing that? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that, assessment's such a buzzword. I probably would, stay away from assessment, but, it sounds easy, but like how's my child doing holistically? As a 3rd grader, as a 4th grader, are they, thriving? It's more about the thriving for me, because they've been, I don't mean to just keep drawing it to my own experience, but they're not thriving. Like, they're getting by, but they're not thriving. So it's like, what's the benchmark, or what's the question that gets at how will you know if my child is thriving in school, or,
Right. No, I know that the assessment is like such a trigger.
But I think a lot of parents are really concerned about assessment. They want, and it ties back to your question, Gina, about feedback, which is, are you actually assessing the kids and knowing my students' work? And can you actually tell me with some degree of certainty where my kid is this year, how much they've learned, what skills they need, where they should be and where they are?
Yeah, like we've had these conversations with the district where they talk about certain schools are using this method and certain schools are using this one. And obviously, different procedures in different places might yield different results. And so,
So Steve, it's Janine. Hi, how are you?
Hey, Janine, how are you?
Good. Quick question. So with everything going with the assessment, so are we back to every school's doing their own thing? Is that what I'm getting?
We more or less, that's the picture we've got.
I know my son, he's been tested. We've had assessments, we've had Lexile numbers. I mean, I know his reading level's gone up, everything's, then I don't know if that's the norm or that's just an exception in this district. I don't know.
Yeah, you said, what was the system you said, Janine? Lexile?
Lexile. It's a reading system.
Okay.
That says what their score when they read. It could be, he's like 1,000 something or other.
Okay.
It's a reading level scale.
Thank you, Simeon, thank you.
Okay.
But that's
what were the other systems? Simeon and Dina, was one of them like iReady? I think that's been mentioned as like a bunch of schools use that on their assessments, right?
Well, so iReady is a supplemental computer-based curriculum that schools use that has some built-in assessment tools. And so the schools can use it. By kids participating in it, provides some data about students, and you can set it for diagnostic assessments.
Right.
iExcel is another program like that some schools are using. And originally, Dr. O'Brien said, I think what we're going to do is ask schools that are using these various systems to sort of, do an assessment of some sort to see where their kids are. Now, what I heard last week from Dr. Prado or Mr. Prado is that they're talking about a school-wide standardized assessment to really dive into. And it sounded like they were thinking about either iReady or the NWA MAP test, which could both be standardized tests.
Okay. Oh, right. That's right. He has within a month and a half is the.
Yeah. So Janine, it sounds like they are contemplating a district-wide assessment.
okay.
They're still in the investigating phase.
Because I know we also use, my son has an IEP, so we use Achieve 3000 as a benchmark. But it seemed, but a lot of my parents too have the same kind of consideration of one parent was asking, I think the other night, should they asked to have their child left behind? Do they need to move forward? Are they ready to move forward? You know, these are a lot of questions that, you know, are not, no one seems to give a certain answer to it.
Right.
So, I don't know. I mean,
No, that's a great theme. Like if we're thinking high level buckets, that absolutely has to be a theme, like this question, do you believe your child will be ready for next grade
Yeah.
level?
you know, I'm terrified. Mine's going into high school and I don't know if he's going to be ready.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You know, compared to the private and Catholic schools in the neighborhood, they're going to excel before we do. You know,
Yeah.
and we're supposed to be the ones with the most money, with the most, you know.
Right.
There's there was that other, you know, is like we said, starting with that question, is my child ready for the next grade level?
I'm sorry, I'm a parent actually. Is this for the executive or for everybody? I'm not Zoom bombing. So I got this from my girls' school, so I only don't see a lot of people, so I'm a little confused.
No, this
No.
is what, ma'am, this is a committee. It's a subcommittee of
Oh,
the.
okay. So,
But you're more than welcome here, and we'd love your input too.
oh, okay. I
Yeah.
didn't want you to think I was Zoom bombing. I got the link from my girls' school. Okay, they go to McCullough, so, okay, thanks.
Great, sure.
All right,
And yeah,
I'll listen in, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
So what are next steps for sort of developing the content and also sort of communicating this with the district and seeing where this overlaps with their existing surveys and what they're interested in?
Yeah, do we think we want to just sort of come up with high level sort of buckets tonight, get sort of maybe 3 or 4 buckets, and then within that's just kind of the thinking in my head. We could do maybe one bucket is focused on retrospective, one bucket on, do we want to talk about the summer at all, or just sort of look to the fall?
Well, I think that could be part of that question. I think if you scroll down, it's there about, you know, like what, maybe it wasn't there, but sort of what do you want to see? I know maybe it wasn't there.
Priorities question?
Yeah, the priorities question, like maybe summer school is part of that.
Yeah.
And then that could be there.
And that's more, I'm doing that more on a timeline basis, those categories, but maybe we want to organize the categories completely differently and organize them based on.
Also, instead of ranking those individually so that they're not pushed against each other, we could have each one ranked. How important is each one of these to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And take a look at each one
Yeah.
independently.
I think that's a good idea. Hmm.
And that's really easy to just quickly ... on the screen.
Yeah.
And we're planning on, you know, like we, as committee, we go through these questions and then we share them out with the broader council. Yeah.
Yeah.
Then I'd say start with less.
Yeah.
Because it can always grow.
I mean, I honestly, I think the questions maybe like these are great questions. And I think honestly, we come like to be determined, honestly, like at some point in the next few, you know, the exact specifics and how we word them. And
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not wedded to these. I just threw them out there to get us focused on questions. And
totally.
I think, yeah. And I think I actually, speaking to your point, Stephen, I think we should start maybe not going chronologically, you know, timeline wise, but going future back, you know, so starting with what do you want to see happen? I think if I'm getting a survey and they're asking me more about what I want to see, I'll feel a little more empowered to continue the survey than how my experience has been the last.
And there might be a little bit of fatigue with the, how have things been and remote, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
Some of this will be informed if we really do need to get our hands on a copy of the citywide survey, because that could really inform some of this too. But on the type of, like, to the point of trying to hone in on different cohorts of parents, right? Like ELL, MLL parents, student with disability parents, G&T parents. My thought was this: if we have something in the survey that identifies them as such at the beginning, and then we just leave it at that, and maybe try to keep the questions more focused on sort of learning that can be applied to any one of those categories. Just thinking about a couple things, trying to keep it, I don't want to make this survey too, like it's seeking a certain outcome. I don't want it to be a referendum on any specific narrow agenda, if you will. I'd like it to be informative, and I'd like us to be able to break it down by the type of parent speaking or responding. But again, try to make it sort of an honest process and not seem like we're leading to any particular outcome. That's just a thought I had. And so it might guide some of these questions as well.
And that's not
particular-
something the district would help us with, that sort of demographic break.
Anyway,
Well, I hear what you're saying about wanting to just disaggregate by different types of parents and their types of children. That makes sense, but at the same time, if you want to dive into, or do we want to dive into, I mean, because special education services is a very unique type of experience. And, you know, to try to just disaggregate parents' overall satisfaction with their education by whether or not their child has a disability is very different than trying to look at their experience with the services they got, or, you know, things like that.
yeah.
It's a level removed in a sense.
Yeah. So, and I guess one question would be, do we want to organize it like forward-looking, start with some forward-looking questions, and then do sort of maybe some thematic buckets? Like, does everything necessarily need to be on a sort of timeline fashion? If we have a forward-looking section, and then maybe we break into some thematic categories, curriculum, extracurricular, like we've talked about, you know, David's comment today, you know, what worked, what didn't, and based on these things, what do we want to try and do going forward? So I do think that argues for a retrospective category as well. So maybe a forward-looking category, retrospective, and then maybe curriculum and non-curriculum, maybe our 4 buckets, high level.
So I guess, what is the curriculum and the extracurricular bucket focused on?
Like if I'm looking at the priorities here, like if we had biggest priorities for next year, we could obviously dive deep into any kind of curriculum instructional categories, academic acceleration, academic remediation. And then I sort of and then you get to social emotional counseling, extracurricular, culturally, you know, I guess culturally responsive, that's curriculum. Tutoring is curriculum. Just thinking about separating things out to.
Well, I think if we have for each one, how important is this to you? I think you can have a sort of a long list that doesn't have to break it into pieces.
Okay. So all in one, like all curriculum, like if we did a retrospective section, but then the forward-looking and curriculum and forward-looking are kind of blended. They're kind of the same thing. Like here's the survey. I was looking at a survey from an organization, TNTP. Yeah. Natalia, can you share the survey I sent over? But these categories, like they're high-level buckets, and I'm not saying we need to do all these, but they have wellness. This is for parents. Wellness, access, student learning, communications and expectations, and that was it. And then there's 5 or 6 questions within every. Oh, and then connectedness and support was another category. Yeah, actually, just keep it right there, Natalia. That's perfect, because those are like the high level categories. I don't know if we want to look at it, if those trigger any thoughts. And this stuff is all experience. This survey, I think, is mostly, this is backward looking. This is school year 2021. So this is very much a backward looking survey. some of these are more like, I'm looking at this communication section. I mean, I don't know if some of this it's sort of more legit, it's sort of more nuts and bolts. It's like, how do you prefer to receive information about your child's schooling? By text, by phone, by email. I don't know if some of this stuff could help the CEC. Like if we want to take a section of the survey and try to use it on, get a sense of what could help us be a better communicator with parents.
Well, now you're moving away from a brief
Yep, I know.
big picture survey to some pretty granular stuff.
If we had a bucket on like the CEC, like if we had a bucket on like, are you aware of the CEC? Like, that kind of stuff. That could be one bucket to look at. But
I mean, I think that might be the most useful for us, less useful for the district. But again, it goes back to, what purpose is this survey serving? Is it, partnership with the district and trying to get information for them to better plan for next year, for them to understand what happened this past year, in which case isn't the city or, doing that anyway. Or, for us to understand how we can better engage as a CEC, the families of our district.
Yeah. I kind of like some of both if we can. I wouldn't mind one that sort of really helps sort of inform the next CEC and sort of, I wouldn't mind that if we can squeeze that in, but.
Remember, we can also have, spaces in the survey for qualitative responses. So, we can have all these quantitative, rank this, prioritize that, et cetera. But then you can have space for parents to write in, add, anything you want to say about this, or how do you feel about that?
Right.
And that's stuff that we won't be able to necessarily quantify, but at least we can read through it and say, all right, I see some patterns, or I see a bunch of issues, or here's a bunch of ideas that we can use.
Right. The only, as you know, Simeon, the concern on that is time that it takes to go through that stuff, especially with the language translation. But yes. So, all right. So would it help maybe if we talked about vendors next before we sort of, I'm almost thinking like we have a lot of ideas with the having the vendor conversation now. Actually, what if we had just, are there any parents on the line that, I don't know, Melissa, did you want to make any comments based on sort of content? Melissa was a parent coordinator, I believe, at one of the schools.
Yes, hi, I'm here.
Hey, yeah.
I think the questions that you have are, all of the questions are very good. It's very similar to the survey that just went out recently. Are these questions what's going to go on this, like similar that we're going to see on the parent survey that they're trying to release in May?
When you say they, is it the citywide one?
Yes.
That's what we'd like to find out. We'd like to get our hands on a copy of the citywide one. Like we all filled it out as parents, but I don't remember what the questions were.
Right. Okay.
So we want to make sure there's not a lot of
the redundant same questions. Yeah. I do like the question of, how are my children doing? I know someone mentioned that. So like if your children are doing well, I know for me, they changed homerooms a little bit. I have a middle schooler, he's in 8th grade. So there was some changes for reprogramming halfway through the year with that last window that opened up. And, I know he's doing well. I see his grades are doing well, but it's hard to monitor how well is he really doing? Are they being a little bit more lenient, that type of thing? So I do think that is a very important question, like the communication, even though the teachers do reach out, like how do we gauge how our children really are doing?
Yeah.
So I think that's a great question. And then when you speak about bringing vendors in, what exactly do you mean about that?
Yeah, maybe we can get into that because we're definitely going to talk about that. These would be third-party survey firms, including one that Panorama Education that did the citywide survey. So we'll touch on that in some detail in a second. But but yeah, that would be the idea. And just to make it easier, you know, we're the CEC, we're all volunteer.
Yes,
It's tough for us to.
yes, I totally understand.
Cool. And I think Janine, Janine, did you want to say anything else about the content of what we've talked about, or should we go to the vendor discussion?
Oh, I think your content is very good. I think you just have to see how you want to, what format and what vendor would accommodate it.
Yeah. Okay. Natalia, can you share the screenshot, the vendor comps that I sent over? Okay, so these are two vendors that we've spoken with, Qualtrics and Alchemer, which used to be Survey Gizmo, but they maintain the Survey Gizmo brand name for business. And the good news is both are approved city vendors. We have pricing information on each, and right off the bat, I'll say that the services offered seem pretty comparable, frankly. So a lot of it might come down to price. Qualtrics has a $2,500 quoted for us, and the sales rep backed that up. The list price is $3,000, but he told us $2,500, and he said he'll stand by that. That gives us 5,000 responses with only one user. So one of us would have to be the sort of primary designer of the survey. And just so we all know how this works, basically we create our own survey using the software that these vendors provide. And the beauty of using a vendor is that the integrity of the whole process is really enhanced. The data goes right from the district to these vendors. There are privacy agreements in place for each of these. Qualtrics, that's a real advantage. They specifically already have a New York City DOE privacy agreement, and they provided that to me today. And so Alchemer, when I spoke to them, the guy wasn't sure if they did, but he said they can be completely HIPAA compliant. It's a BAA agreement that gets filled out. I forget exactly what that means, but we would just need to follow up on that if we use them. The interesting thing about Alchemer on their pricing, it's different from Qualtrics. Qualtrics has, as I said, this $2,500 12-month license, 5,000 responses model. Alchemer can do a monthly. So Alchemer could do 3 months, 3 users, $149 a month. That works out to $1,300 for 3 of us.
And how many survey responses?
Unlimited surveys, questions, and responses.
Okay, because that's my big concern with Qualtrics is, 5,000 may be a hard push, but if we do this right and parents all see this coming from the district and say, okay, this is worthwhile, serious, we may get over that, and which may be very expensive.
Right. And we would be forced to shut it off at that point, which would not be optimal. What else did these two say? Okay, Natalia, so I think that kind of covers the pricing and the privacy, and then down to sort of the features of each one. This is not comprehensive. I browsed each one over the weekend. I mean, there's so many features on both of these. I think they're pretty comparable, frankly. I just noted a couple things that you've asked about, Simeon, the skip logic. It's there on both. Quotas was an interesting one I noticed. I don't know if we want to think about that, but basically it sounds like you can, if you sort of target different cohorts in your survey, and once you receive a certain number of responses from that cohort, it sounds like you can shut off further responses. And so you can sort of get the responses you want. I don't fully understand it, but that's essentially how I interpret quotas for each of them. Qualtrics doesn't give real-time results. Survey Gizmo does. I don't know if we care. Anyway, the feature, it's a much longer list than I have here. I don't really want to. I found Survey Gizmo slightly easier to navigate. I just had a free account. I just literally tried to start a survey for each one, and I found the the environment, the operating environment for Qualtrics a little bit easier. But again, we're not making a decision tonight on a vendor, but just whether to use a vendor, I think. Languages, that was interesting. Qualtrics, we have to select the languages, we translate it, and then what happens when they're done design, wait a minute, let me make sure I'm saying this right. We select the languages. When we're creating the questions, it's a little tedious because you have to click each language you want that question translated into. So for each question, we would have to click 6 languages if we wanted the top 6 languages. And then when the survey, when we get a draft version of the survey, a preview version, it comes in whatever language, it comes in the different languages, and we have to get a native speaker to review it. We have to do that ourselves. So whether that could be the DOE or, you know, not optimally a volunteer basis, community organizations, something like that. So that's how that works. And then on the, for Survey Gizmo, yeah, can include a language dropdown is what the guy told me. We have to build it in different languages. And so it sounds like, I don't understand it as clearly as the other one, as Qualtrics, but it sounds like we would have to provide some of the translation ourselves. Now, for what it's worth, the DOE did recommend Survey Gizmo as being very good with languages. But they also didn't talk, I didn't talk with them about Qualtrics specifically. So either way, we'll have a little legwork to do on languages, probably with any vendor we use. And then training support, it's kind of the same on both. They have all these on, kind of the similar online stuff. Can you scroll down a little bit, Natalia? And it's pretty similar on how it works. Both get the data, both provide individualized links straight to parents, both have an extra add-on for text. It's almost exactly the same pricing. It's interesting. So that's, you know, clearly we want to focus this on email if we can. So those are the two. And I like the idea a lot of trying to use a vendor, just if we just want to approve or not approve that. I don't know what you guys think.
I think for the legitimacy of the distribution, I think a vendor makes sense. I think the question really is the cost. Can we afford it?
Yeah.
What is the bottom line number going to be?
Yeah. We've talked about this. This will be something we have to decide Wednesday, but Natalia and I talked a little bit today, and she can, we were talking about the P card and the supplies. And right now, I don't officially know. There's a couple people have told me they're going to get back to me on what reimbursement they will and won't use. And so it's hard to nail it down right now. At the minimum, we have $13.85 on the reimbursement money. Basically 2,000 less than I thought we had last Friday. So at the minimum, we have $13.85 in reimbursement. Natalia's offered up the P card, which hasn't been spent at all. And she's also offered up the supplies budget. So that's $2,000 potentially more. So at most, you're looking at $3,400. At least you're looking at $13.85.
I mean, I haven't looked at the budget. Is there any other money that is unencumbered that's going to just go back to the district at the end of the year?
That's what I said. That well, not unencumbered, but that's what we were saying. I was saying with the P card, Natalia's offered to free up that money and the supply budget, just given her expectation that she won't be spending $1,000 worth of money on supplies.
But everything else has been allocated and spent?
Everything else is allocated. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I think you should. I think people who haven't gotten back to you are sort of on the fence whether they want to use the reimbursement or not, and it wouldn't be wise for us to.
Yep. Agreed.
To move it. So we should just stick to whoever's gotten back to you and whatever that, you know,
Yep.
definitive amount is.
We have to do it that way, but it's going to be really sad if there's $2,000 left that people didn't get reimbursed for that goes back to the district we could have used for this.
But it sounds like then Survey Gizmo is the one we sort of have to go with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, unless the money can be transferred that Natalia's offered up, right?
Oh,
the P card and the supplies,
Mhm.
because that's $2,000, and that would get us to basically to $3,400.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this will be decided again. This will be decided on Wednesday. You know, I agree. I would really like. I hope people see the value in this. But
so the other thing I'm going to just keep saying though is if we get, say we get 5,000 back, representing 5,000 students, we can do an analysis to see how well that reflects sort of generally on the district, but we still cannot say that this is a really strong representation of the district because it's not random sampled. The only way to say this is a strong representation of the district is if we get, 65, 70% of people to respond to it, which I think is unlikely. So I just think we have to be very careful with this data and how we use it and what we say it represents.
Yeah, Simeon, I had a brief conversation today with the team from Alchemer. I mentioned it to you last week, their panel services team. And it's not immediately clear to me that team necessarily would necessarily provide a true statistically authentic random sampling process. He was talking about the self-service panel. You sort of find the general population. You find the panel. He was talking. I guess he was talking about getting parents, finding a sample of parents, and then getting them to commit to providing responses. So I think that to some extent that does sound like creating a targeted sample of a population. He talked about. And then he said they use Cint and Lucid. It goes out to a third party, I think. I hadn't heard of those. I don't know what those firms are. But he said we could do things like targeting it by school. The example he gave me was, he was like, yeah, we would take what you guys wanted to achieve with the survey and then go find it. For example, looking for all the left-handed doctors in Canada. So, Cint and Lucid were two third-party database providers. And I said, well, can we provide our own data, from the district? And he said, I do believe so. So.
Is there anything about cost?
Yes. $1. So there's two packages. If you're doing a small survey, $1.50 per response. And then there's a $1,500 product that's the more in-depth version. And when you run the math, $1.50 responses, we would exceed that pretty quickly. 3,000 responses, and we're at $4,500. And this is on top of we have to have an Alchemer membership license anyway. So we would have to get the $1,300 monthly package and then add this on top of it. So this is, in a way, this might be where we get the difference between Qualtrics and Survey Gizmo. You layer this on the monthly plan, and suddenly you have a $3,000 product, which is comparable to Qualtrics. And I don't know if Qualtrics is offering this kind of service included in the price I have. So should we?
We'll talk to one more vendor on Wednesday, right?
Yeah. I was just going to say, should we just agree to sort of move forward with the third vendor, get the comparables, and then recommend as a committee to the council that we move forward with this? And effectively, I'm going to have to recommend it on Wednesday at 3. But I think that's doable. And I think we should be able to make the case to get as much money as we can into this category, and then ultimately at a future meeting recommend the vendor once we decide who it is. So yeah, I like that. Now, having said this about the vendors, do we want to go back on categories, or is that something that kind of be fleshed out maybe over email in the coming days, weeks?
Maybe we can just group the doc Simeon started, put it into a Google Doc, and then we can edit together, sort of just, group the questions together, throw some subheads in there. When is our committee? Are we a monthly committee, or are we ad hoc in terms of our schedule?
To be determined.
Yeah.
Ad hoc, I guess.
Because then we can do some of that brainstorming in a shared Google Doc and then discuss instead of using meeting time.
Yeah, I think the goal should be a certain, a finite number of buckets, a manageable number of questions, that capture some of the things we've talked about tonight. And the
So why don't I add in some of the things we talked about, and then I will send it over and you can create a Google Doc.
Sure.
That we can then all start jumping into. And
sounds good.
Yep.
I mean, the things that I've got on my list, like we've, you know, the big thing, forward-looking, ranking priorities. How are we measuring where our children are at? What are we using to assess that? Those are sort of the two big things that I'd love to see. And then I guess the superintendent's priority, it sounds like, what worked, what didn't. That was literally something he said to me just today. So, you know, that could kind of be in the retrospective. Sort of if we could kind of think of a way to concisely get at that angle of it.
I think the satisfaction kind of tells you
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
whether you're satisfied with this or not.
As long as it's, yeah, sort of overall is one thing, but then, you know, his comment was what worked, what didn't.
Like he wants to specifically know, like, you know, Google Classroom worked, but, you know, I don't know.
I don't know if he wants to go that deep, but to some extent, I think he's going to kind of leave it up to us on that too. So that might have been more just kind of a, you know, how to structure the tone and sort of messaging of the survey.
Yeah, it doesn't. I think it'd be really hard to kind of.
Yeah, I don't
know
want to
what
go.
he means by that. Yeah, exactly. It's more like here's my thoughts on what you should do. Yeah.
So maybe it's somewhere below. Agree. Like, so maybe it's somewhere between what's your overall satisfaction and what do you think of all the different software products that your school was using? Somewhere between those,
Yeah.
I think that's the right answer.
Right. Hmm.
So I think that was was that like 3 big high level categories? What do you want to see happen next year? How are students being, student progress
Mhm.
level of learning being evaluated? What
Mhm.
worked, what didn't from the past year?
Mm-hmm. And do you know what CEC is?
I like it. I would love to have a fourth one, just sort of about the CEC. I don't know. It could always be kicked off later on if we just get too much sort of pure academic content in there.
Okay. Shall we call it a night?
I think so. I'm really hesitant to open it up to.
I know. I'm scared.
Yeah, I think we can call it.
People can
Yeah,
type
we're definitely not going to let Satan in. I saw Satan was just in the waiting room.
Oh,
Sorry.
goodness. Oh, goodness. I want to thank you guys so much for all the work that you do. This was great and very interesting to listen to and be part of.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you,
Joining.
Melissa, for joining.
Have a
Yeah.
great evening. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you.
Nice to tell you.
This is
Take care.
probably the shortest meeting we've had this year.
Awesome.
Or, not counting Friday.
Hopefully productive and useful. Cool.
All
All
right,
right.
have a
And
good
sorry,
night. Yeah.
who,
Oh, sorry.
do you guys want me to set up the doc just real quick, or Simeon, were you going to do that? Just make
Yeah, let me do it. Let me try to add some more of the stuff we just talked about, and I'll take
Okay.
maybe some stuff from the document you sent and see if there's stuff we like that I can throw in.
Okay. And then I will follow up, get the New York school survey so we can cross-check it with that.
Sounds good.
All right. Cool.
Good night.
Thanks, guys. Good night.
Night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Hi,
Good night.
Natalia.